Hey, I went to the post office today, and when I went to the countertop, I happened to notice that they were selling Christmas ornaments of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And this is the portrait that hangs in the White House. And you can get it as a Christmas ornament. So I've been doing a lot of videos on JFK, and it just struck me like, what's he doing on the countertop at the post office? And for some reason they're trying to resurrect the imagery of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And this would be the portrait that hangs in the White House. It was done in 1971. It was the only portrait that was painted of a president after a president had died. So all the portraits hanging in the White House were painted of the president while he was alive, but not this one. So I thought I would check into this, and I have some videos here for you to watch about it. Each year in the White House, the portrait of the former president is officially included in the White House, and there's a special ceremony each year. The former president comes back. Now, of course, with Kennedy, because of the hoax assassination, this portrait will not get into the White House until 1971. So I'm going to play a video about the painting of this portrait, make a few comments, and then play another video.
My name is Aaron A. Schickler. What do I do for a living? I paint. Nothing but memories of who he was, and they sent me to a vast room filled with photographs. There was one photograph where he was walking up the steps, but his head was at a perfect angle, and it was a great photograph to use that. The next big problem was, what the hell do I do with the rest of the body? Then one day, Ted Kennedy was over his grave there in Washington, had his hands like this, looking down at the spot where JFK was buried. And then I said, perfect, that's what I'm going to do, put the head on that body, but I had to slice him down. Ted Kennedy's a heavy man. JFK was not heavy. So that's how the whole thing got developed. Because of his head down like that, right away, the first thing somebody from Newsweek magazine said, that's not a portrait of a president, that's an assassination portrait. Jackie loved it. And that's the one person you want to make happy.
Okay, what I want to say is, I'm not sure that was an artist that was speaking to you. My first impression was that was the actor George Burns. Notice the cigar, notice the glasses. I'm not sure, I didn't do further investigation, But usually that's the way it is. It just hoax anything and everything. So I'm going to play this other segment now to show you sort of the contradiction between what the so-called artist said and what the curator of the White House will say.
We're standing here today in the Cross Hall, the long central corridor on the state floor of the White House. This hallway and the adjoining entrance hall and the grand staircase nearby are the locations for the portraits of the most recent former presidents. Today's portrait of interest is above my right shoulder, is the Aaron Schickler 1971 portrait of President John F. Kennedy. Perhaps a little more unusual than other portraits in our collection by having assumed this contemplative pose, which was described at the period as being a way that the president was often seen in photographs. The portrait was inspired by a request from Mrs. Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy had asked Schickler to do studies for a portrait of herself, and at the time he was visiting with her, she raised the question whether he would consider doing a posthumous portrait of President Kennedy. Schickler thought about it. Mrs. Kennedy sent him some photographs, and he tried to contemplate how he might paint the portrait of a subject that he had never actually had sit for him. Mrs. Kennedy sent a New York Times article and said that she had been interested and haunted almost by the photograph that the Times had used with the article about the death of her brother-in-law, Senator Kennedy. And it showed President Kennedy with his back to the camera in a contemplative pose, and his brother Robert, who was the Attorney General, in profile in a contemplative pose, as they were considering the world-shattering activities of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And she said, I've been haunted by this picture, and I think it would be the right one to inspire a portrait for the White House. Schickler studied it and decided he would create something that would capture the strength, the courage, but as he said, it wasn't dire solitude in the president's part because he had his brother there with him. And so this pose that is not a traditional one, since you don't see his eyes, it's in this facing down pose, that was what he captured as how to remember President Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy came back to the White House only once, in 1971, at the request of President and Mrs. Richard Nixon, when the portraits were ready to be hung in the White House. And she brought the children, Caroline, who was then 13, and John Jr., who was 10. And they visited rooms that they had lived in, and they went to the Oval Office and saw the portraits. And she said this was a very moving experience. And that was the only time she returned to the White House after leaving in 1963.
Okay, just a couple of comments. I hope you noticed how the portrait of JFK was painted and illuminated in a yellow gold. Now that yellow gold is the color of the devil. Okay, it's the false light of Lucifer. The false light, the yellow gold. Now, did you notice a slight contradiction between what the curator said and what the so-called artist said? Okay, the artist was discussing how he got inspired was when he went out to the grave of JFK and he saw Teddy Kennedy in that position, and that's what inspired him to make that position for the portrait of JFK. But the curator never mentioned that at all. So you wonder, does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? And is it just all a bunch of baloney? Someone else painted it, and they just had George Burns act like he was a painter. Now I can't prove it because I haven't done an analysis, but just offhand, it sure looked to me like that was George Burns talking to you with the cigar and the glasses and everything, claiming that he's a painter. Also, they mentioned that his eyes were not included in the painting, and his head is bowed. So that what I would say is, for me, that's kind of this position is a shame. A shame. Okay? He's ashamed of himself. I don't know where they're giving you a bunch of hokey-pokey nonsense about his strength and character and stuff, but that's kind of a position of shame. And the shame is that he knows that the so-called assassination was just a hoax. Just a hoax. And notice how the lamp is like a sort of a eerie type lamp, and that whole gold yellow environment there to suggest very strongly the work of the false light of Lucifer. And no eyes. Now why? Because he can't look at you. When people are ashamed of themselves, they drop their head and they don't want to look at you. They don't want eye contact because they know they've done wrong, and they can't take the penetrating look of an honest individual sizing them up for their deeds. And I think whoever created this painting is trying to tell the American people, this individual needs to be ashamed for the hoaxes, the Cuban Missile Crisis hoax, the Bay of Pigs supposed invasion hoax, November the 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas, hoax. Drop your head. Keep it dropped and let the American people see your shame. He's not going to look at you because he or she is ashamed of the hoaxes that were pulled on the American people. So back to the post office. I couldn't believe it when I got to the post office and there was an ornament for sale. All my videos I've been doing in the 60s, and now they're trying to peddle this one, the White House ornament, Christmas ornament 2020 with JFK with his head dropped. So there you have it. You can decorate a tree with JFK and his head dropped. You know, the Bible talks about when the Messiah comes, everything will be made correct. The exalted will be humbled, and the humbled will be exalted. And that's what it's like in the kingdom of God, in the true messianic age. That those who have deceived us, such as JFK and all presidents, all will drop their heads in shame because of the evil deeds they've conducted over the years of the history of the land that we know as America. I'd like to thank you for watching this video. End of video.